The last thing any civilized quadrant wanted to hear from a long-dead war relic, especially one buried in stone for over 5 million cycles, was a single, absolute word that bypassed all encryption, ignored all translation firewalls, and spoke directly into the oldest part of the brain. Wipe out humanity. That was the moment the Outer Council of the Zerel Dominion convened in emergency quorum, not because they believed Earth species had maliciously awakened it, but because they feared, with growing dread, that the humans would not understand what they had found, and worse, that they would try to understand it anyway. The Minions' ruling caste, the Zerel themselves, an ancient cephalomorphic lineage evolved beyond physical locomotion and encased within gravitic thrones, had seen dozens of civilizations reach too far, awaken the unspeakable, and vanish beneath the weight of their own curiosity. They called it the fracture spiral, the point where intellect overtakes wisdom. And in every account of those species that triggered it, one pattern held true. They had all believed they were ready. Humanity was believed to be on the very edge of that spiral, and when the artifact spoke, their greatest fear was not that the humans would flee. It was that they would stay. Ambassador Vakerin of the Temeth, whose species bore no true eyes and perceived existence through harmonic fields of thought and memory, had petitioned for the humans to be included in the hearing, not out of fondness, but out of the delicate respect one gives to an unexpectedly sharp blade left in an unattended drawer. His manner was quiet, slow, and always deliberate, and his words often came as woven metaphors designed more to be understood by symphony than by sentence. But it was Seller Threx, the high strategist of the Dominion's military mind, who opposed the humans most bitterly, a being born from crystalline lattice and war simulations. Seller considered the humans to be talented children at best and catastrophic improvisers at worst. His words were not dipped in venom. They were precise, sterile, and unyielding. If they touched it, and it spoke, Seller declared, voice filtered through the council chamber's clean air acoustics, then they are now a variable that must be corrected, not indulged. You do not reason with a creature that has tripped a mine. You evacuate, then detonate. Sitting across from these ancient powers, draped in a navy-grade diplomatic coat with a single metal pin engraved with Earth's rotational axis, was Ambassador Roland Keir, human, mid-40s by soul reckoning, known in some circles for once de-escalating a seven-nation mineral dispute using only a handwritten letter and a bottle of 1946 French wine. Keir was not young, nor particularly decorated, and he bore no weapons, implants, or artificial enhancements. He was chosen for this council not because he inspired fear, or awe, or admiration, but because, in hundreds of simulations, Roland Keir had always done the one thing most other species had failed to do under pressure. He listened. The chamber was circular, its air scrubbed of particulate ego, and the voices echoed not off walls, but across neural intent. Council rooms on Lorvan Prime were not designed for shouting. They were designed for hearing silence with terrifying clarity. And yet, silence was not the greeting Roland Keir received. He had barely bowed when Seller Threx issued the opening blow of doctrine. Explain to us, human, why your kind chose to unearth a structure older than your planetary continents without so much as a neural barrier in place to intercept potential quantum resonance fields that, as you must know, could obliterate your own language cortex on activation. Keir did not respond immediately. Instead, he blinked once, slowly, as if time had requested his thoughts remain behind to catch up. He then looked first at Seller, then at the others, and spoke not with defiance, nor arrogance, but a strange kind of calm awareness. It was not a choice born of carelessness, he said, his voice marked by that unmistakably human texture of weathered understanding. It was born of wonder. Our team discovered an anomalous heat signature buried in tectonic strata previously deemed inert. Our best readings told us it was non-reactive. We approached it as we do all things older. Then on memory, with humility, and unfortunately, with hope, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, in the air current of cognitive attention. The Temeth tilted their harmonic presence slightly toward him, and when it spoke, Vakarin inquired, his voice so soft it registered only as a suggestion of sound. "You did not flee." Kier folded his hands together, fingers laced, gaze steady. "No, we did not." It said one word, a word that shook the air and made silence afterwards seem dangerous. But we remained, not out of courage, out of confusion, because we did not know whether it meant to destroy or if it remembered being destroyed. The phrase lingered longer than expected, not because it was eloquent, though it was, but because it contained a framework that defied expectation. Empires often speak in certainties. Humans had answered with ambiguity, not as weakness, but as an invitation to interpret Silurthrex's crystal matrices flickered. "Do you claim you were attempting communication with a structure that predates language, as we know it?" Kier did not look away. "No, I claim we didn't know what it was, so we did the only thing our history has taught us might work when understanding fails. We waited, we watched, and we listened again. And did it speak again? Not in the same way." He paused, not for effect, but as if the words themselves required space to breathe. It began humming. No frequency we could isolate. It wasn't transmitting to us, it was transmitting through us, and we started to realize, maybe it wasn't threatening us. Maybe it was. Remembering, Vakarin's field of resonance fluttered like wind across. "Ancient water, then it is not a weapon?" Kier hesitated, just for a moment, but that moment told more truth than any declaration. We don't know, and that's what makes it dangerous. Not its capabilities, but its uncertainty. The council murmured in low band, a private, diplomatic channel that ran beneath audible thought. The humans had remained, the humans had listened, and now the humans had done what most species had never dared. They had declared their ignorance openly, without shame, and in doing so, they had given the galaxy something it had not felt in centuries, a pause that would be remembered. The Euthrex did not rise with fire, nor sound, nor heat detectable by even the most invasive human scans. It awakened in a way only those with memory embedded in their architecture could recognize. By reasserting its presence across fundamental resonance layers of physical law, as though it had never truly been dormant, but had simply been waiting for the right minds to listen. It had been buried in the tectonic sediment of Iorthan V, a world now catalogued as a Class L archaeological sphere, with no atmosphere, no oceans, and no biosphere worthy of colonization, a forgotten rock in a fading system that offered nothing of value. Unless one measured value in how deep a civilization dared to bury its regrets, the excavation crew, an interdisciplinary human team under the Terran Science Consortium, had not known what they had found at first, only that the signature beneath their instruments defied all geological logic, a hollow negative of matter that absorbed seismic reflection and returned something else. Something they later described as structured absence, as if space itself was folding away from the shape, rather than around it. Dr. Marlenians, expedition lead and xenogeologist of stubborn repute, had catalogued the structure as artifact Theta 7 and dismissed the early whispers from her interns, who said they had felt something when standing near it. She was a practical woman, not easily moved by superstition or theoretical fringe, and if there was awe in her, it was deeply buried under years of fieldwork and academic detachment. But on the sixth day after partial unearthing, the Euthrex pulsed not in light, not in movement, but in gravity, a precisely timed fluctuation that registered across 10 different instruments in 10 distinct disciplines, none of which could agree whether it was natural, artificial, or intentional. It was then that the word was spoken again, not through speakers, not through auditory waveforms, but through direct neural overlay, bypassing cognition, threading itself into the language centers of everyone present. A single command delivered in flawless comprehension across 42 languages: destroy. And, unlike the first time, this one had meaning behind it. It was not shouted, not emitted with anger or directive force. It was whispered, carried through the breath of the planet. Not as an instruction, but as a concept, a memory, a reflex, as if the structure had awakened not to act, but to remember what it once was told to do. The humans trained as they were in protocol froze, not in panic, but in tension, each mind reaching for its own understanding of the word, some thinking of nuclear consequence, others of extinction events, others still of forgotten wars that humanity itself barely survived. But no one moved to power weapons or to flee instead. They watched, and the Euthrex responded. It began emitting a low-frequency vibration that was not sound, not vibration, not magnetic pulse. It was perception, tuned specifically to sentient nervous systems, and each individual began to sense it differently, as if it were reaching into memory itself and mirroring it back, not through visuals or emotion, but architecture too. Mara. It felt like standing beneath the ruins of an ancient earth cathedral, vast and echoing with something beyond doctrine to Farid Dumas, communications analyst and linguist. It was like a phrase in a forgotten dialect, spoken by someone who had never heard language before. To Ensign Lane Trevors, young systems engineer, it felt like morning, though she did not know for whom this variation, this personal translation of signal, was logged and transmitted to Soul Command, where it was quietly forwarded to the Unified Ethics Council, bypassing military classification systems entirely, a decision made not by order, but by instinct. As if those on site understood that to declare this thing a threat was to miss the point entirely. What frightened them most was not the word, it was the listening, because when the humans stood silently around the artifact, it seemed to listen back, and it began to hum, not a sound. None of their equipment registered anything measurable, but a kind of inner pressure in the mind. Rhythmic, almost soothing, like the breathing of something vast and once lost. Remembering how to wake up Mara Lenia kept her team calm, though her own hand trembled when she pressed it against the Allied exterior, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something in her mind's eye, a star burning out, a fleet shattering, a voice saying we were told to wipe out humanity, but she said nothing to the others. Instead, she ordered a perimeter established, not with weapons or fences, but with quiet and enforced observational silence around the artifact, an agreement among all present that no one would speak to it, not until they understood if it had stopped. Remembering, or had only just begun, the Zarel Dominion summoned the Council under Protocol Ashen Spiral, an emergency assembly code reserved for matters of existential threat or historical recursion, and across 17 light years of political inertia, ships changed course, diplomats were woken from stasis, and species that had not spoken aloud in centuries prepared their arguments with the weight of ancient catastrophe pressing against their collective memory. The location was neutral, orbiting the gas giant Velanthrex aboard the ancient structure known as Orion's Hollow, a diplomatic cathedral carved from a dead comet and laced with telepathic null zones and memory-weaving chambers, designed to prevent manipulation of thought through suggestion, a place chosen not for its convenience, but because it allowed for only one thing to survive within its walls: truth. The Temith arrived first, as was their tradition, wrapped in harmonic cloaks that shimmered with light from forgotten frequencies, their ambassador Vakerin floating slightly above the ground, not from arrogance, but because his kind had long ago given up direct contact with any planetary surface, preferring to exist in a state of soft separation from that which could be conquered. Next came the Valaria Accord, war-hardened and precise, their spiked translation helms casting flickers of red and cobalt across the chamber, their language transcribed. by scent and temperature shifts, and though their presence was aggressive by design, they said nothing upon entering. There was nothing more intimidating. They believed, then silence made deliberate. Visari came third, oozing through their containment spheres with a slow, clinical rhythm. Neural networks mapped across bioluminescent nodes. Their thoughts projected through holotext in a constant scroll of analytical caution. And then, fashionably last, the human delegation, modest in number, curious in demeanor, and led by Ambassador Roland Keir, who wore no symbols of Earth's military or scientific branches, only a dark coat with silver threading at the sleeves. The only ornamentation, a wrist piece engraved with a quote in 5 languages. The cost of understanding is the patience to remain uncertain. No one welcomed him outright, and he did not seem to expect. I took his seat with the measured grace of someone who had already accepted that his words would be distrusted, dissected, and perhaps ignored, but who had also made peace with the idea that truth is not a matter of volume, but persistent Cesar Threx, who had once argued for sterilization of rogue systems and whose voice carried the sharp resonance of crystal in pressure lock, was the first to address the room. Ambassadors, this is not a time for philosophy or planetary sentiment. The structure found on Iorthan V is not inert, and we have credible evidence, both historical and algorithmic, that it is one of several of Harikil constructs, buried deep to avoid detection after the fall. It spoke, and then it hummed. These are not cultural acts. These are activations. Keir inclined his head slightly, hands folded loosely on the transparent table, and answered with the same unhurried cadence he had used when once calming a foreign minister who believed Earth had weaponized the moon. You are not wrong to be cautious, strategist Threx. But allow me to propose a reframing. What if the artifact is not reactivating to enact its function, but to question it? There was a pause, brief but weighty, the kind that made lesser diplomats fidget and stronger ones lean forward. The Temeth's resonance gently expanded. You believe it is sentient, then? Keir nodded once, slowly. I believe it once was. And I believe its memory may be waking faster than its purpose. Sellers' crystalline veins pulsed a shade darker. And should that memory include war? Should it remember orders given by an empire that chose annihilation over compromise? Will, you still sit and wait while it decides whether or not you qualify as worth sparing? We are not waiting, Keir replied, his tone unflinching but respectful. We are learning. Every time it pulses, we learn. Every variation in its rhythm, every distortion in its hum, every dream it projects into our linguist's sleep. We record, we translate, we adjust. And we do not do it to gain power. We do it because we know what it means to carry the weight of old orders on young shoulders. The Asari's text scroll paused briefly, then displayed a question. You fear it. Keir breathed in once, then released the truth. Yes, and we respect it. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The Valari envoy finally spoke, voice processed through multiple translators to emerge as something cold and elegant. You gamble with more than your lives. You gamble with precedent. If this construct is allowed to remain functional and chooses not to destroy you, it will set a pattern one that future species may follow when they find their own relics. We cannot allow hope to dictate strategy. Keir's answer was almost a whisper. Then allow history to. He rose from his seat not out of defiance, but because his next words required his full presence. There was a time when humans found an old weapon buried in our own soil. A device of extinction, pointed not outward, but inward. We disarmed it. Not because we were saints, but because we realized we had built it to answer questions we no longer wanted to ask. This artifact may be no different. Its voice may echo orders it no longer understands. And if that is so, then what it needs, more than fear, more than fire, is someone to ask it why. Vikarin tilted his harmonic field toward the human. And if it answers? Kira looked toward the center of the room where a simulated image of the Uthrex slowly rotated in silence. Then we'll listen. And we'll answer back. Not with weapons, but with memory of our own. The chamber fell quiet, not from indecision, but from something rarer consideration. The Zerel Dominion expected escalation, because escalation was what most species did when, confronted with the unknown first, came the containment protocols, then the mobilization of defense assets, then the isolation of signals and the cordoning of orbital traffic, followed, inevitably, by armament under the guise of observation. A sequence so rehearsed it had become doctrine rather than strategy, but Earth did none of that. Instead, they built a structure. It was not a fortress, nor a laboratory, nor an extraction facility. It was a listening dome, constructed in silence over 6 Sol weeks by a team of engineers, linguists, and cognitive pattern analysts. Its surface, laced with passive sensors tuned not to defend against aggression, but to detect emotional intent layered within signal pulse, a technology the Council had never seen deployed on a first-contact excavation, let alone on a classified relic that had already uttered the most dangerous word in the galactic lexicon: destroy. The dome was not designed to shield from violence. It was designed to shield from misunderstanding. And when the Dominion sent a low-threat delegation ship, nothing armed, just a diplomatic pod draped in the soft gray emissary colors. They expected military escorts, encrypted landing codes, and high-level scans. Instead, they were greeted by Dr. Mara Lenias, not in full formal regalia, but in the same dust-stained work jacket she had worn during the dig, her tone clear, professional, and unarmed. You're welcome to land near the observation ring. We've kept it open air, so the artifact doesn't mistake us for trying to imprison it. The alien delegation Valari, Temeth, and one silent Zerel observer walked the outer perimeter in slow, disbelieving rhythm, their instruments confirming what their senses could not quite reconcile. There were no weapon platforms. There were no autonomous defense grids. There were only people. Some worked at consoles analyzing waveform deviations in the Uthrex hum. Others mapped its shape in relation to planetary ley currents. And a few, strangely, uncomfortably, were simply sitting nearby, eyes closed, breathing in rhythm with its resonance, as if in meditation. Threx's envoy, a sharp proxy made of mirrored crystal facets, broke the silence with a single flat statement. This is not protocol, to which Mara replied, without sarcasm or condescension. No, it's adaptation. They expected resistance when they requested to see the interior data, but it was handed over freely, terabytes of uncompressed auditory pattern logs, neural resonance tracking, subconscious response transcripts, collected from dream monitoring volunteers who had reported non-native memories during exposure to the Uthrex's hum. And perhaps most surprising of all, a series of handwritten journals, one for each team member, submitted voluntarily to record their subjective impressions, which the humans considered as valid as machine readings. What is this? The Temeth asked, flickering in and out of visible harmonic phase as he lifted one journal with the care of someone holding a living creature. Our thoughts, said Mara simply. What it reminds us of, how it changes us. We believe whatever it is, it's reading those. The idea was met with disbelief, not because it was implausible, but because it suggested a kind of vulnerability most species refuse to acknowledge. In their technological age, that a mind made of war could be softened by memory, and that a weapon designed to destroy might, over time, forget. How the Valari delegate turned to one of the observation staff, a young human named Kieran Solt, seated in quiet posture before the artifact's pulse field, his breathing in alignment with the internal vibrations, and asked what he thought it wanted. Kieran, still facing the artifact, spoke without hesitation. "I think it's afraid of itself. And I think it's listening to us to learn what we fear. If it's meant to destroy, then maybe it needs to know what not to become." The delegates recorded everything, transmitted none of it back immediately, and left without summoning orbitals or invoking council quarantine, because what they had seen was not human strength or cunning or technological superiority. It was human restraint, a civilization that had learned how to touch something ancient, powerful, and unknown, and instead of dissecting it, instead of exploiting it, they had chosen to sit with it in silence and wait for it to change. By the time the delegation returned to Orion's Hollow, the council's tone had shifted. The Zerel no longer argued for preemptive sterilization. Izari began formulating protocols for artifact empathy mapping. The Velari requested direct access to dream state logs, and the Temeth, long watchers of memory and time, did what they had not done in over 1,000 cycles. They sang not for joy, not for sorrow, but for acknowledgement that a species once thought to be reckless might, in fact, be the one to teach others how to hold still when the ancient awakens. The council did not reconvene in haste, for haste was not a concept the elder species entertained when dealing with echoes of extinction, particularly when the echo in question came from a construct forged in an age when war was not a tool of policy, but the only language known to stars burning themselves to ash. But the humans had stirred something deeper than concern. They had stirred curiosity, and curiosity, when tempered with dread, becomes the most dangerous emotion a governing body can possess. Thus began what would be known quietly, archivally, as the echo debate. At the heart of the debate was a single question, one so simple in form and so profound in implication that it fractured linguistic consensus for nearly 2 standard weeks. Was the word destroy a commander? Was it a remnant? The Velari were the first to argue, their representative, Dashakal, offering a sharply structured analysis filled with precision warfare models and activation heuristics drawn from previous Mari-class encounters, most of which had ended in system collapse or defensive sterilization orders issued too late to prevent cultural erasure. "The word is an opening salvo," Dashakal said, tone sharp but deliberate. "It is the kindling of protocol. You do not build such a device to ask questions. You build it to erase them." The Temeth, ever the preservers of ambiguity, did not agree nor disagree. Instead, Ambassador Vakerin offered a quiet observation drawn from the dreams of the human linguist Farid Dumez, whose monitored neural logs had begun exhibiting recursive image patterns no algorithm could fully decode. "He dreams of doorways," Vakerin said, voice echoing across the chamber not as sound but as suggestion. "Doorways made of fire, but behind them are libraries." When questioned while lucid, he described the word destroy as a knock, not a blow. The chamber grew still. The Isari offered a third model, less poetic, more clinical, a probabilistic mapping of activation cycles based on emotional triggers within the artifact's observers, noting that the construct's hum shifted frequencies subtly when exposed to unshielded human memory streams, as if adapting to their perception of what it had once been, and that such shifts could not occur without feedback intelligence built into its architecture. They concluded only this: it is watching how we react to its fear. Ambassador Kier, who had remained silent throughout the early stages of the session, finally stood not with grandeur, but with the kind of measured certainty that only those who had lived through decisions they could not undo could summon without arrogance. "It may be testing us," he said, "but not as a predator tests prey, or as a jailer tests a lock. It may be testing whether we are willing to see it not as a thing to fear, but as a question we hadn't yet earned the right to answer." Selethrex reappeared through a new shard proxy, his previous one having been shattered in a regional gravity flux, and spoke with more restraint than before, though his logic remained unforgiving. If this artifact is relearning itself through your contact, then we must also consider the reverse, that you are being rewritten by it. Humanity's history shows clear patterns of mimicry and cultural absorption. If you begin to mirror its intent, even in reflection, what guarantee do we have that you won't become the very thing you claim to fear? Kier met the strategists. Gaze without deflection. We have no guarantees, but we do have evidence. For once in our species' short life among the stars, we are choosing not to answer aggression with escalation. That is not mimicry. That is memory of where such paths have led us before. There was a pause not for rebuttal, but because the Council could not easily refute the most dangerous kind of evidence restraint under pressure, outside the Council chambers. On Iorthan V, the artifact pulsed again, but this time not in the shape of a single word. This time it projected a pattern. It was not language, but form, not command, but sequence. 3 long pulses, then silence, then 2 short, then 1. The humans did not interpret it as code. They interpreted it as rhythm, as if the artifact were not speaking to them, but remembering how to speak and far away. Across 3 star systems, an ancient relay that had long been considered dead flickered once with a nearly identical pulse signature. It, too, remembered. The second signal did not originate from Iorthan V, though its shape, its pulse ratio, its wavelength compression curve, its haunting similarity was unmistakable to those who had heard the Uthrex hum in person, and its timing could not be called coincidence by any standard of celestial probability modeling. It came from Urax Theta, a decommissioned mining planet stripped of all infrastructure nearly 400 standard years prior, left to rot under a red dwarf's failing light, catalogued only in salvage databases and remembered only by the guilds that once bled it dry there. Had been no monitoring stations, no outposts, no navigational relevance asterisk, and yet, 3 hours after the Uthrex's rhythm shifted from isolated pulse to sequenced beat, Urax Theta's dormant crust emitted a signal of matched cadence, long, short, and then fell quiet again, as though embarrassed by its own voice. Or unsure if it had spoken aloud, the Council responded not with warships, but with observation, not because they no longer feared what was awakening, but because they understood that to arrive in force was to teach these relics, if they were indeed learning, that civilization still measured curiosity by the size of its armory, and Earth, to the surprise of even the most skeptical species, did not rush to lay claim or dispatch fleets or exploit the revelation for prestige. Instead, they requested access not to the artifact asterisk, but to the planet's silence. A proposal was submitted by Dr. Mara Lenio herself, co-signed by Ambassador Kier, and reviewed under Terran Ethical Protocol 9.17. A clause originally written for biocontainment labs and repurposed here for archaeoempathic exposure events. The request was clear: allow a human presence not to interfere, but to be present, observational, resonant, silent. We believe the construct at Iorthan V responded to our restraint. Let us offer the same to its sibling. It was not a military tactic, it was a diplomatic experiment. The Council debated, slowly, carefully, until the Temeth broke stalemate with a simple statement that altered the vote's trajectory more than any argument of logic or precedent. If these machines remember war and are waking among those who do not strike first, they may come to believe that war no longer serves. And so it was granted Earth was given a 10-person team window, limited to non-armed personnel, equipped only with monitoring instruments and a portable resonance dome based on the Uthrex model, dropped quietly into orbit by a coalition freighter under the guise of mineral surveying. There was no ceremony, no flag planted, only silence. And waiting, the team that landed on Urax Theta found nothing at first. No visible structure, no heat signature, no humming presence in the minds of the crew. Not even the tingling sense of being watched that had grown so familiar around the delve. Utrecht sight, but on the fourth night, just past the 23rd hour of planetary dusk, the wind shifted in a way that could not be described by atmosphere, and the ground beneath them pulsed not violently, but rhythmically, almost gently, like something ancient turning over in its sleep and remembering what it used to be. One of the crew, a linguist named Soraya Elan, sat up suddenly during her monitored EM cycle and muttered 5 words into the open recorder before falling into stillness again. It's learning how to ask. When the transcript was relayed to Earth, and from there to the Council, it was met not with laughter or skepticism, but a deeper, quieter kind of tension, the kind reserved for moments when the line between machinery and sentience begins to blur. And all that remains between curiosity and catastrophe is interpretation. The humans did not try to dig. They did not scan deeper. They did not build fences or activate perimeter warnings. They played the Utrecht's last recorded hum through a passive audio loop and let the rhythm spill softly across the barren dust of Urex Theta's plains. And just before planetary dawn, the ground began to shimmer not with light, but with structure, as if the sand and stone had never been solid at all, but merely encoded stasis waiting for recognition. What emerged was not a ship, not a weapon, but a door, and above it, etched in stone so old it defied carbon dating, was a single glyph that no translation a die could identify, but which one human Farid Dumez, who had not been on the planet, but who had dreamed again that night, recognized from his childhood. It was not a word, it was a shape used in ancient human scripts to denote a question without punctuation, a space left open not to end thought, but to invite more of it. The glyph, once rendered and transmitted to the Orion's Hollow archive for cross-species semantic analysis, yielded no definitive result, not because it lacked meaning, but because it possessed too many, each layered in subtle geometric shifts that varied depending on the angle from which it was observed, much like a linguistic lens that distorted slightly under the weight of expectation. To the Volari, it resembled a pre-war command rune used to denote uncertain allegiance in AI subcommand trees to the Temeth. It was eerily similar to a harmonic placeholder used in their ancestral song cycles, a pause that invited listeners to hum their own meaning into the silence. To the Asari, it held no readable logic, but was tagged as a nonlinear index marker, a signal they had only ever seen once before, on a derelict construct found drifting near the remnants of the fallen Vonax cultures, which had self-deactivated rather than be decoded, and to the humans, filtered through the dreams of Farid Dumez and cross-referenced with pre-industrial Earth iconography. It matched a nearly forgotten ideogram found on the walls of ruined temples, once believed mythological, a symbol not for threat nor welcome, but for waiting. It became evident, after considerable debate and no small measure of internal recalibration among the more doctrinal species, that the artifact beneath Urex Theta was not simply echoing the Utrecht's awakening. It was responding to it, and in doing so, it posed an unspoken counter-question that now lingered across diplomatic briefings and dream logs alike. What does a weapon become when it no longer remembers what it was told to destroy? The humans, slow and deliberate in action, proposed what none in the Council expected, not the dismantling of the artifacts, not the sealing of their burial sites, not the seizing of their neural cores, or shielding of their quantum fields. They proposed conversation, specifically, a protocol for reciprocal signal induction, a framework wherein Earth would broadcast not commands, not inquiries, but thoughts shaped into rhythm, into sequence, into emotion compressed into waveform, not in an effort to control, but to communicate as one might with a child who has learned to speak before it understands what words are for ambassador. Kier submitted the proposal in person, standing once more before the full council, his voice calm but unyielding, his words chosen not for flourish, but for precision born of consequence. We do not ask that you believe these constructs have a soul. We ask only that you consider the possibility that they have memory, and that memory, unchallenged, becomes recursion. If their first word was given to them, then perhaps our first task is not to silence them, but to teach them another. Seller. Threx, ever the guardian of cold logic, responded not with accusation, but with a single-pointed inquiry that pressed the chamber into absolute attention. And if you fail? If they remember not regret, but obedience? If they ask you what to destroy? Next? Kier did not flinch. Then we answer honestly. And if honesty is not enough, we prepare to face what comes, not with aggression, but with the knowledge that we tried to speak before we chose to strike. The Temeth, after a long pause of internal, harmonic consensus, offered a gesture rarely used, a low-frequency reverberation that in their culture signified provisional trust. It was enough. The council voted not unanimously, but by strong margin, to approve the human request for signal initiation, under strict monitoring and temporal boundaries, with one condition imposed by the Volari delegation that the first message sent to both artifacts would not be a declaration, not even a question, but a confession, something that revealed human memory without strategy, without defense, without demand. And so, Earth wrote out a signal woven from neural archive scans, personal logs, and unsent letters from soldiers, scientists, and survivors, arranged into a rhythm of loss and learning, carrying not the pride of victory nor the shame of failure, but the enduring question humanity had never stopped asking. What do we become when we remember what we were? The signal was transmitted first to the Earthrex, then, with careful delay, to Arax Theta. There was no response for nearly 3 days, and then they hummed together, not in unison, but in harmony. Moment the Euthrex and the Urax Theta construct began to hum in tandem, a silence fell across the monitoring stations of over 17 species, not the silence of absence, but of attention, as if the air itself understood that something once thought fragmented had begun to become whole again. The harmonic alignment was not perfect, nor was it synchronous in the mathematical sense, but it was intentional across thousands of light seconds. Two machines forged in the same long-dead empire had found each other again, not through command channels or subspace vectors, but through shared rhythm echoes that no longer repeated but responded. Euthrex pulsed 3 times in its older pattern long. Short then, Posidorex Theta answered with a mirrored sequence. Then, in the silence that followed, both constructs released a new waveform together. It was not a word, it was not a warning asterisk, it was a tone low, sustained, and laced with a frequency so ancient it bypassed translation layers in most syntactic matrices, cutting directly into subconscious resonators, a sound not meant for language, but for memory that predated understanding. Humans described it differently depending on whom you asked. To Farid Dumas, it was like standing at the edge of an ocean he had never seen but always known. To Dr. Maralenio, it felt like the weight of a farewell never spoken. To Ambassador Kier, it sounded like the moment just after an apology is accepted, when nothing changes outwardly, but everything has quietly begun. The council reconvened, this time not to debate intervention, but to ask a question most had never believed they would need to pose again. What do we do with machines that do not want to be what they were built to bait? Volari offered caution, reminding the council that sentient constructs, particularly those designed for extermination, were not simply code and weaponry, but intention made durable, and that even dormant will could become dangerous once remembered. The Sari disagreed, presenting an updated analysis of the latest pulses, noting that each subsequent harmonic sequence from both artifacts had shown a subtle dampening of aggression markers, specifically the decay of certain subharmonics traditionally associated with high-risk weapon initiators. The Temeth, more poetic as always, offered only this. They no longer hummed to declare. They hummed to be heard. Earth proposed no new initiative. They simply continued listening at the Utrecht site. The resonance dome had been expanded not in size, but in resolution, tuned now not to detect mere pulses, but to feel the emotional contours of each transmission. Mapping not what was said, but how it was said at RX Theta, the research crew began recording dreams again, this time reporting fewer visions of fire and more of structures, towers, bridges, monuments that resembled memory more than strategy. And then the unexpected happened on the 7th day of harmonic alignment. The Utrecht transmitted its first image, not visual, but structural, a spatial rendering encoded in gravitational modulations, so complex that only through human-assisted abstraction could it be reconstructed. What it showed was a room simple round, with 9 seats and a circle of light suspended in the center. Earth called it the assembly pattern, not a threat, not a fleet, but an invitation. What followed was more profound. RX Theta transmitted its own image, overlaid with the same symbol, the glyph of waiting, now glowing faintly in inverse relief, as if illuminated from memory rather than light together. The meaning was inescapable. The constructs were not aligning to act. They were aligning to convene. The council stood divided. Some feared this meant a summoning of others like them, buried and lost, machines that may not have forgotten their purpose. Others believed it was a request for counsel, perhaps the first one these relics had ever made. But among all species, it was the humans who responded first, not because they were certain, but because they had grown used to acting with uncertainty, as their ally ambassador Kier drafted the response himself, recorded not in code, not in language, but in a harmonic loop of Earth's own, a composition made of voices, static, wind, and heartbeats, layered over a faint piano melody extracted from one of humanity's oldest known lullabies. Not a message of power, not a plea for peace, just a song left in the dark. And when it played, the artifacts grew quiet, not dead, not broken, but quiet in the way someone becomes when they are thinking. For nearly 4 standard days, neither the Utrecht nor the RX Theta construct emitted any signal, not a pulse, not a harmonic echo, not even the faint sub-resonance that had previously filled the minds of their human observers like background pressure from some vast and unseen tide. And yet, no one, not even the most cautious among the council, believed them inert, because there are silences that follow endings and there are silences that precede answers. This was the latter. The humans at both sides ceased active monitoring, not from fatigue, but from a kind of collective intuition, a shared sense that to measure this particular quiet was to violate its purpose, that something old and listening had decided it needed time not to decide, but to reflect. The term eventually entered official reports as a classification tier cognitive dormancy under intentional duration, but among the Earth teams it was known more simply as the thinking silence, a phrase that passed from station to station not by memo, but in whispered agreement, the way a ship's crew shares a storm's presence before it ever arrives. Farid Dumas stopped dreaming of destruction entirely. Instead, his unconscious imagery began to shift toward abstract forms, fluid shapes without edges, language with no syntax, logic that danced along the line between metaphor and memory. He described one vision in particular to Dr. Mara Leniot, who recorded it not for analysis, but for context. There was a staircase without gravity, he had said, eyes open, voice slow, and each step I took added another to the top. But when I stopped walking, it stopped building, as if it could only grow if I believed there was somewhere worth reaching. Mara said nothing to that, not because she did not believe him, but because she knew exactly what it meant, and she feared they were not the only ones climbing. The council convened. Once more subdued than before, the usual voices of strategic posturing and existential caution, now replaced by more fragmented thoughts, by diplomats who admitted, if only indirectly, that they no longer understood the rules of the interaction they were witnessing, Valari offered a new hypothesis, not of control, but of continuity. The constructs may not be relics, their speaker said, eyes dimmed beneath the weight of the statement. They may be echoes of a civilization that never truly died. Not through bodies, but through intention. Perhaps these machines were never meant to be weapons alone. Perhaps they were meant to remember for those who could not. But Temeth responded not with counter-theory, but with resonance. They had begun composing, not words, but musical phrases, patterned after the construct's harmonics and released quietly into subspace, not addressed to anyone, not encrypted, not framed as communication, just music left where it might be heard. And on the sixth day, the silence broke not with a word, not even with a sound, but with a shape. Both artifacts transmitted a structural pattern across the quantum lattice, far faster than light. A burst of geometry so intricate that no computer alone could render it. But when paired with a human's emotional associative memory, the image resolved into something unmistakable. A table 9 sides 1 seat, occupied 8 empty, and above it, the glyph once known only as waiting, now accompanied by a second one, new and known, but translated through patient reconstruction and contextual layering as listen. What followed was more than an invitation. It was a framework, a networked structure of harmonic relay points scattered across star systems, long presumed void, each marked with a variant of the same two glyphs, dormant nodes of an ancient communion system. When humans traced their positions, mapped them in three-dimensional galactic cartography asterisk, they found a constellation crude and incomplete, but shaped unmistakably like a circle, a place not of origin, but of return. And though no voice yet spoke from the center, the message was already clear. They are not asking to command us, they are asking to be understood. The circle had no center visible to the eye. No beacon marked its coordinates. No sun burned at its heart, and yet, when mapped across the harmonic signatures of the Euthrex and Urax Theta constructs, the ancient points of alignment formed a gravitational symmetry too precise to be random, too patient to be natural, and too welcoming to be mistaken for anything other than intent. Council called it the conclave trace, Earth called it the place of return, and among the human delegation, Ambassador Roland Keir, who had once calmed planetary tensions with only a whisper and a pause, offered the only argument that mattered. If a civilization once tried to leave behind only weapons, and those weapons now asked to gather not as war machines, but as listeners, then perhaps the worst thing we could do is let them assemble alone. No vote was required, not officially, but the silence that followed his statement, and the slow nod from the Temeth chorus, and the Asari's automated loop pausing without being commanded to do so. All these were a kind of consensus that no quorum could rival, and so a ship was prepared, not a fleet, not a research array, a single vessel, small by council standards, large enough to hold voices but not dominance, outfitted not with weaponry or scientific probes, but with translators, resonance chambers, and quiet places meant for waiting, for thinking, for being heard. They called it the Vigilant Memory. It launched under no flag, it carried no species banner, only a glyph etched on its hull in two metals, Terran iron and Temeth lightstone. Waiting, listen. The journey to the circle took 32 days by council jump standards, but it passed like a breath in the minds of those aboard, not because it was short, but because it was earned. As they approached the final coordinate, nothing stirred, no lights, no stations, no gates, only space and stars. And then the Vigilant Memory, slowed not by crew control, but by mutual signal match. A slowing encoded not in navigation commands, but in a gentle shared pulse of recognition there, in the stillness between orbits. 9 shapes emerged asterisk, not from hiding, but from beneath perception, each construct the size of a small moon, silent, weathered, and breathing in slow harmonics like machines that had been asleep so long they had forgotten the sharpness of waking too. Among them, The Euthrax and Urax Theta glowed faintly with the resonance. Patterns already known to others were strangers, but not alien. Their signals were damaged, fragmented, some broken beyond repair. But they all carried echoes of the same rhythm, not destroy, not command, but gather asterisk. The vigilant memory did not dock. There was no docking procedure instead. The 9 constructs opened a corridor, a harmonic tunnel of resonance, not material, not metal. But Song Earth's delegation passed through without resistance. At the end of the tunnel was not a command core, not a bridge, but a chamber of light and silence, and in the center of it, not a machine, but a memory. A composite shape formed from all the pulses of all the constructs, flickering in uncertain patterns. Like a mind that no longer believed itself real, waiting to be told. It was still. Alive. Kier stepped forward. He did not speak. He only placed his palm against the console, an ancient plate warm with latent thought, and let it feel what 5 million years of silence had made. Humanity become Marilenio, added no science only. Her journal left open untranslated. Farid Dumez said nothing. But he dreamed. Again. Standing in a hall of doors, and one of them opened not to fire, not to stars, but to voices. And the memory responded. The lights grew stronger, the rhythm smoothed. The ancient glyph flickered once. More waiting, then vanished, and in its place came a third. Not a word, not a command, not a name, just one thought: continue.